PhD in Germanic Studies and Philosophy from the University of Chicago, and he's a humanities teaching fellow here. He's editing and translating the writings of Alfred Zonretto, and is especially interested in Hegel and Marx. And if you allow me to say, I think nobody has done more for this conference than Daniel. So if we have one person to thank, it's Daniel.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks. So hello, everyone. My name is Daniel, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the next two speakers for the fourth panel today on political economy. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, as well as the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group there. She's the author of many books and articles, including Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire from 2013, and more recently, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, 2022. And she'll be presenting a paper titled, What's in a Name? The Misuses of Feudalism and Capitalism. Our second presenter is Michael Hudson, a distinguished research professor.
I haven't turned on the video yet.
At the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a researcher at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. He's a former Wall Street analyst, a political consultant, as well as the author of many books, including Superimperialism, which was reissued in 2022, originally, I believe, 1971, Killing the Host, 2015, and most recently, The Collapse of Antiquity in 2023. He'll deliver a paper titled, Is the West Regressing into Neo-Feudalism? So Professors Desai and Hudson will both speak for 30 minutes each, and then we'll have 20 minutes set aside for discussion. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Radhika.
I have no PowerPoint. No. Is this the right angle? Oh, okay. Thanks. And I hope Michael has joined. Does anybody know if he's joined? Great. Okay, so first of all, thank you to the organizers, particularly Daniel, as we are told, who's done the most for this session. And I'm really pleased to be here, really pleased to hear everyone who's spoken so far. Looking forward to Brett Christopher's presentation later on, and of course, Michael's. So as Daniel pointed out, I've entitled my talk, What's in a Name? The Misuses of Feudalism and Capitalism. And in brief, I'm going to argue that by calling the contemporary economic system in which we are living neo-feudalism, we are demonstrating our misunderstanding of both feudalism and capitalism. But let me first start out by saying that there is no doubt that the literature on so-called neo-feudalism, or at least the best of it, is concerned about a real problem. So for instance, to quote just one of the relatively good pieces on the subject, Stone and Kuttner make some excellent points. They say, and I'm now quoting, it's slightly longish quote, so I'll tell you when it ends. The system of finance, they say, once supervised by bank regulatory agencies and Securities and Exchange Commission, has been delegated to private realms of law. The financial collapse of 2008 is best understood as the seizure, corruption, and abuse of entire domains of regulation and jurisprudence. Laws to protect workers and consumers reflecting 70 years of struggle to expand rights are now erased by compulsory arbitration regimes. Trade law permits similar private tribunals to overturn or sidestep public regulation. Tech platform monopolies have created a proprietary regime where they can crush competitors and invade consumer privacy by means of onerous terms, often buried in online terms of service provisions. The unity of common scientific inquiry has been balkanized by confidentiality agreements and abuses of patents. As scientific knowledge becomes owned by private entities, companies like Monsanto manipulating intellectual property and trade law prevent farmers from following the ancient practice of keeping seeds for the next planting season. This, they say, is not deregulation or neoliberalism. It is legally sanctioned private jurisprudence, neo-feudalism, unquote. So what Stone and Kuttner says is that not only is this not capitalism, it's not even neoliberalism. And of course, I'm going to argue that it is neoliberalism. It has always been about expanding private power. That is, neoliberalism has always been about expanding private power. It has never been about markets or competition. And I'll elaborate on that as I go along. So like most conceptions of neo-feudalism, Stone and Kuttner idealize not only capitalism itself, but in their case, implicitly, and which they idealize implicitly, if not explicitly, in its competitive form, as though that is the only type of capitalism. There is no other type of capitalism. And Stone and Kuttner also wrongly assume that they're idealizing neoliberalism because they think that it's about markets and competition. And that's why the reality of what is happening now must, according to them, be separated even from neoliberalism. And then, of course, they idealize what Stone and Kuttner call democracy, which they equate with the golden age of capitalism, when I think we will all agree that capitalism was on its best behavior that it has been so far. So that's the way I see the situation. Now, there are many things wrong with this. The first and most important is that competition always culminates in monopoly, or put it another way, monopoly is the result of the process of competition, which eliminates rivals, leaves a handful or one entity standing out of the competition. This is the destiny of capitalism as classically analyzed by Marx. Moreover, Marx goes further because he has something to say about what happens at this point. In chapter 27 of volume 3 of Capital, Marx had outlined how the ever greater concentration of capital in large monopoly firms, facilitated by the emergence of joint stock companies, constituted a huge advance in the socialization of production. This was, for Marx, the most important function of capitalism historically. The only reason why he considered it at all progressive was that it socialized production. It may do it brutally, it may do it anarchically, but it does it. And that's what's progressive about it. And it will have, under monopoly capitalism, brought that process of socialization to a peak. In this type, a new type of firm, Marx says, what was once individual capital, quote, now receives the form of social capital, capital of directly associated individuals, in contrast to private capital. And its enterprises appear as social enterprises as opposed to private ones. This is the abolition of capital and private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production itself, unquote. That was Marx. The transition to monopoly, aided by state intervention and credit, is, Marx continues, a self-abolishing contradiction, which presents itself prima facie as a point of transition to a new form of production, unquote, namely socialism. As production is thus amalgamated and massified, its profoundly social character is on full display. The owner-operator of early capitalism is split functionally into two: the manager paid for his or her labor of oversight of a complex organization, and the mere money capitalist who no longer makes profit but only interest, a mere reward for capital ownership, which is now completely separated from the actual production process, unquote. The result is a historical rather than merely conceptual clarification, according to Marx. The profit is reduced. Let me say that again. The result is a historical rather than merely conceptual clarification. That is to say, in the process of the arrival of monopoly capitalism, something gets objectively clarified, not just conceptually. Profit, according to Marx, is reduced to interest, is exposed as, quote, simply the appropriation of other people's surplus labor arising from the transformation of the means of production into capital, that is, from their estrangement vis-a-vis the actual producer, from their opposition as the property of another vis-a-vis all individuals really active in production, from the manager down to the lowest day laborer, and unquote. That's okay. Such capitalist production in its highest development. So Marx considers monopoly capital to be capitalist production in its highest development. Such production is, Marx continued, and this is the key, the necessary, I'm quoting him again, quote, necessary point of transition towards the transformation of capital back into the property of the producers, though no longer as the private property of individual producers, but rather as their property as associated producers, as directly social property. It is furthermore a point of transition towards the transformation of all functions formerly bound up with capital ownership in the reproduction process into simple functions of associated producers, into social functions, unquote. Engels observes editorially at this point, because he edited volume 3, that tendencies toward cartelization and toward concentrating, quote, the entire production of the branch of industry in question into one big joint stock company with a unified management, unquote, prepares, quote, in the most pleasing fashion, its future appropriation by society as a whole by the nation, unquote. And this development, according to Engels, was likely to be aided by the fact that this transformation also gives rise to monopoly in certain spheres and hence provokes state intervention. So essentially what Marx and Engels envisage is that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly phase, it will be ripe for transition to socialism. This will be apparent to everybody because productive forces have been massively centralized, they are monopolized, and the illegitimacy of the private ownership of monopoly will become apparent to all. This is at least his anticipation, their anticipation. Marx then goes on to refer in particular to the role of the financial system at this stage. What is the financial system going to do in this process? However, before we can understand what he meant by that, we must understand how he conceived the evolution of finance under capitalism, a point originally made by Marx and later elaborated by Hilferding in Finance Capital. So let me unpack this a little bit. Though financial capital is older than industrial capital, because financial capital existed before the onset of productive capitalism, Marx anticipated that capitalism's maturation would lead to the, quote, subordination of interest-bearing capital to the conditions and requirements of modern industry, unquote. Principally through, quote, the transformed figure of the borrower, unquote. The borrower would no longer be a supplicant. I've got 20 minutes left. No longer be a supplicant in financial straits, but a capitalist to whom money is lent, quote, in the expectation that he will use it to appropriate unpaid labor, unquote. Whereas the initial stages of this process of subordination had led to calls of using, quote, violence, that is the state, against interest-bearing capital to effect a compulsory reduction of interest rates. So the bourgeoisie is militating against financial capital in a certain way. Mature industrial capital, Marx opined, would achieve this transformation much more thoroughly and effectively through, quote, the creation of a procedure specific to itself, the credit system, which, and I'm quoting him now, which is its own creation, as is itself a form of industrial capital, which begins with manufacture and develops further with large-scale industry, unquote. When it first emerged, the credit system took a polemical form directed against old-fashioned usurers. Now, in line with this understanding, Hilferding says the following. Hilferding says, at the outset of capitalist production, money capital in the form of usurers and merchants' capital plays a significant role in the accumulation of capital as well as in the transformation of handicraft production into capitalism. But there then arises a resistance of productive capital, that is of the profit-earning capitalists, that is of commerce and industry, against interest-earning capitalists. Usurers' capital becomes subordinated to industrial capital. As money-dealing capital, it performs the functions of money which industry and commerce would otherwise have had to carry out themselves in the process of transformation of their commodities. As bank capital, it arranges credit operations among productive capitalists. So Marx is saying essentially that capitalism would take the inherited system of finance and transform it into something that would aid the expansion of productive capitalism. Since I have less time, I'm just going to jump to this. Okay, so Hilferding, as you very well know, or you should know if you don't, in finance capital contrasts two very different forms of financial systems. On the one hand, there is the long-term finance provided for long-term productive investment, of which the German financial system is paradigmatic. And on the other hand is the British financial system, which provides only short-term commercial credit, has never been involved in long-term commercial investment, and is associated with speculation and short-termism. Sorry, I'm just jumping a little bit here, so give me a second. Right. And so the paradigmatic finance capital, although it involves the domination of finance capital, this domination is exercised in the interest of expanding productive capitalist investment. So in Hilferding, these two forms of investments are not just contrasted historically, that is, there is the old usurers form and now there is the new capitalist form, but also geographically, in that he contrasts German bank industry relations, as I've already said, with the British system. And I would like to emphasize one thing. To anticipate some points I will be making at the conclusion, let me also say that precisely the polar opposite characteristics of the British system to the German system is what enabled the British system to be the operator of the gold sterling standard. The German system then would not have been capable of doing this, as will not the Chinese system today. For all the talk about whether the renminbi will ever replace the dollar, I have been arguing in numerous writings and speeches and so on, that it cannot and should not, unless China wishes to see the type of deindustrialization experienced by the UK and the US. Having made these points, we are now ready to return to how Marx sees the role of credit and finance in the transformation of capitalism into socialism, a point which Hilferding also develops further. The credit system, which is everywhere a creature of state regulation for Marx, greatly aids these processes because, quote, it reproduces a new financial aristocracy, a new kind of parasite in the guise of company promoters, speculators, and merely nominal directors, an entire system of swindling and cheating with respect to the promotion of companies, issue of shares and share dealings. It is private production unchecked by private ownership. And further, he says, I'll skip that a little bit. And then he says the credit system not only accelerates capitalist development, the credit system of this evolved capitalist sort, of the German sort, it also accelerates crisis and the dissolution of capitalism itself. In doing so, it moves capitalism closer to socialism. And here I'm quoting Marx again. The credit system has a dual character immanent in it. On the one hand, it develops the motive of capitalist production, enrichment by the exploitation of others' labor, into its purest and most colossal system of gambling and swindling, and restricts ever more the already small number of exploiters of social wealth. On the other hand, however, it constitutes the form of transition towards a new mode of production. It is this dual character that gives the principal spokesman for credit from John Law through Isaac Pereire, their nicely mixed character of swindler and prophet. And as some of you may know, Hilferding is often ridiculed for having said that if you nationalize 6 large Berlin banks, then you will have taken many steps closer to socialism. People laugh at him because they think that the Berlin banks are like the banks today. No, he was talking about 6 large Berlin banks, not 6 large London banks. 6 large London banks, that would have been meaningless. 6 large Berlin banks controlled a very substantial part of German production. This is the key. Okay, so thus here Marx argued that when it arrived at its monopoly phase, when most if not all sectors of economic activity became dominated by monopoly, capitalism would become ripe for socialism. It would have performed its historic function of socializing the forces of production in the highest form. It would be obvious that private monopolies are illegitimate, and it would lose its productive dynamism, something that would take away even the minimal legitimacy it had. Now, capitalism had already reached its monopoly phase in the early 20th century. Lenin was not wrong to say it was the highest phase. Interestingly, neoclassical economics, which took its purest form in the dogmatically pro-capitalist Austrian version, emerged at the same time. And one of its dirtiest intellectual secrets is its conceit that capitalism has remained competitive. Its historical function has been to legitimize monopoly capital through the ideology of free markets and competition. That is why the neoliberal era has witnessed the advance of the power of giant corporations under the covering fire of the rhetoric about markets and competition. This is what Stone and Kuttner do not understand when they say that the current dispensation is not even neoliberal. In reality, Lenin was not being merely rhetorical or just attacking Kautsky when he insisted that capitalism had arrived at its highest phase. Even Keynes and Polanyi anticipated in the interwar period that a certain tipping point had been reached and that the path for humanity at the end of the crisis period after the Second World War lay in humanity leaving capitalism behind and taking another path forward. They didn't necessarily call it socialism, etc., but that's what they imagined it would be, some form of moving beyond capitalism. Hayek feared the same outcome, which he sought to forestall by writing The Road to Serfdom and setting up the Mont-Pelerin Society. In a sense, Marx, Keynes, and Polanyi were not wrong. The world did turn left after the Second World War with the Keynesian welfare state in first world countries, communist regimes from Prague to Pyongyang, as I like to say, and national autonomous development projects in the developing world. Most have misread what happened after the Second World War. They thought that the anticipation of the end of capitalism was wide of the mark and that capitalism had demonstrated its remarkable ability to bounce back. Hence the popularity of Schumpeter, who think that capitalism is like that child's toy. You knock it down and it comes back up again. And that's what it does all the time. But the dynamism of the golden age was not due to capitalism, but due to the socialistic modifications it had undergone. Just to quote Hobsbawm from The Age of Extremes, he characterized this period in the following way. He said, a return to laissez-faire and the unreconstructed free market were out of the question. Certain policy objectives, such as full employment, containment of communism, modernization of lagging or declining or ruined economies, had absolute priority and justified the strongest government presence. Even regimes dedicated to economic and political liberalism now could and had to run their economies in ways that would once have been rejected as socialist. So, yes. These modifications, not capitalism, accounted for the productive dynamism of the post-war era, principally by expanding domestic demand as decolonization and communism closed off other markets. This fact ought to have been clear to people at that time, certainly to Marxists at that time, but it was not. However, after 4 decades of neoliberalism, that is to say, giving ever greater freedoms to capital, and after watching what the results of these 4 decades has been, which has resulted in ever lower rather than ever higher growth, ever lower rather than ever higher investment, we finally can record what a senile monopoly capitalism is like. It is incapable of growth or of investment, and it has turned to financialization and the creation and maintenance of monopoly power domestically and internationally through all means possible. I'm now no longer talking about competition, but the use of state power to maintain monopoly both domestically and internationally. So by calling today's capitalism feudal, we are excusing capitalism. We are forgetting that capitalism itself is historical and that its contradictions are the chaotic motor that drives its history forward, and that those contradictions have brought it to where we are today. That therefore it must not be reduced to an idealized competitive form. That today's economic system is what capitalism looks like when it has run its course and is still being kept alive by the inability of productive forces to take us beyond it towards socialism. And In this present context, it is bound to get even uglier than it is today. Now, let me just say a couple of things about rent. These remarks are more in the form of a research agenda than a finished thesis. I'm not a historian. I'm certainly not a great historian of feudalism, as one of our previous speakers was. So please forgive me, but this is what I would like to say, propose to you. First of all, you have to understand that rent is not characteristic of feudalism. What is the characteristic form of surplus extraction in feudalism? It is not rent. It is feudal dues, tithes, compulsory services, whether they are offered in kind, in labor, or in money, it does not matter, but that is what characterizes feudalism. I should also add that in feudalism, land is not alienable. You cannot buy and sell land. And it is based on, no matter how minimal they are and no matter the misery of the serf, it is based on certain reciprocal obligations of lord and serf, which are completely non-existent in capitalism. Capital does not give a mosquito's ass about what happens to the worker. Okay, so let us remember that. Okay, so as far as I can tell, feudalism's typical form of surplus extraction, as I say, was through various forms of feudal dues. Rent began to intrude upon this scenario. And by the way, I have consulted Marx, particularly the chapters on rent at the very end of volume 3, and I have consulted what I can of Bloch's work on feudalism. Beyond that, I don't know. But let me just say this. From what I can tell from these two sources, rent emerges in the course of struggles between serfs and landlords, in which rent becomes a substitute for the landlord. If the landlord is forced to recognize to some extent certain greater equality of the serf, then he commutes the dues, but he substitutes it with rent. And this is how rent appears, because rent is between two equal contracting parties, not between a social superior and a social inferior. So that's the first thing. So to me, that's what rent appears to be. The transformation of feudal dues into rent represented, on the one hand, the greater social equality of the producer, but nevertheless involved extracting surplus product. Marx is very clear that rent is a capitalist category, and like interest, it is a deduction from profit, wages, and government revenues, all of which are emerge from productive activity of one sort or another. Rentier capitalism, therefore, is what you get when you give capital the freedom that you give it we have given it under neoliberalism, when we keep capitalism alive past its sell-by date. And we have kept capitalism alive by giving capital more and more freedom to do what it likes. And this is what it does when you leave it to itself. Now, I would, how much time do I have? Okay, that's good. I did time it, okay. So I just want to add a final set of points. You know, I said earlier about how the short-termist character of the British financial system between roughly 1870 and 1914 was what enabled it to operate the sterling system. Now, I have also written a lot about the dollar system vis-a-vis the sterling system and how the two are contrasted and how the dollar system has always been unviable. So let me just say a couple of things about that. So, because it's related to this. We live in an age when the idea that the currency of the dominant country is the currency of the world, or should be the currency of the world, has become naturalized. But the sterling system, so when we say dollar is the world's money today, just as sterling was the world's money in the past. But the sterling system sterling was not a national currency. It was an imperial currency. It was able to supply liquidity to the rest of the world, essentially through capital exports, not because it was so wondrously productive of capital that it would afford to export it, but precisely because it extracted surpluses from its non-settler colonies. And I'm talking about British India, later Africa, the Caribbean, etc. But British India was always the biggest chunk of this. Extracted surpluses from these non-settler colonies and exported them as capital exports to Europe, to the United States, and to the remaining British settler colonies. This is why the gold sterling standard period is the period of the most rapid industrialization of these countries. And that is how it exported capital. Even with these surpluses, the system required a short-term financial system because basically, as Keynes's Indian currency and finance describes very well, and by the way, you should all think about why a little book called Indian Currency and Finance is still regarded as the primer on how the gold standard worked. Is because India, British India, not just present-day India, but British India was so central to its functioning. It could not have worked without it. So anyway, as Keynes pointed out, Britain operated the gold standard with hardly any gold. He even jokes that even the Caja of Argentina has more gold, you know about that, had more gold than the Bank of England. And why was it able to do so? Because the moment it needed to, it could increase interest rates and decrease them at will, because also it did not care about the effects of this on economic activity and employment within Britain, because the British working class was not yet sufficiently organized to assert its own interest. We no longer live in that world. So even then, the sort of financial systems that created strong productive systems in Germany, in Japan, in early 20th century United States, they could not have played a similar role because their money was tied up in long-term investments. And the British system, the British gold sterling standard, it is not a surprise that the period of the gold sterling standard, roughly 1870 to 1914, is also the period of the beginning of the long-term productive and industrial decline of the UK, which continues to this day. Unable to export capital, the US has never been able to create a stable system of dollar dominance. Before 1971, it was essentially already, it had a rocky decade before the gold link to gold had to be broken. Robert Triffin explained why this was the case. And after 1971, the dollar system has only worked because the US financial system, which back in the day Hilferding considered to be close to the German one, capable of long-term productive investment, has been systematically transformed into something resembling the British system more. So we're talking about two very different models of finance. The one which is short-term leads to deindustrialization in Britain in the past and in the US today. There is nothing admirable about it. Okay, and then there is another system of finance which Marx anticipated might exist, in mature capitalism and would be the bridge to socialism. It still exists in parts. I would say in substantial way it exists in China today, but that's another whole system of discussion altogether. So I will end here for now. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Radhika. Are you there, Michael? Our next speaker is Michael Hudson. Are you there?
When Radhika and I were contacted about this, we fell for your literary title, Neo-Feudalism. And I was just spending the last 2 years writing the feudalism chapters of my history of debt and finance from the Crusades to the 19th century. So naturally, I wanted to work on the characteristics of feudalism that were being revived today. I thought that was what the whole lecture was going to be about. But then last week, when I had actually 2 meetings with you folks, I realized that what you're really interested in is where is the current capitalist system, the current Western economy going? And you wanted to look at the future much more than the past. And I think that what Radhika has said has paved the ground. You do need a historical perspective to see the dynamic that we're on that is leading to the future, and that helps. But basically, we have to begin to describe today's economy. Radhika used the word monopoly capitalism, and that was a word used in the 1930s. I never liked it that much. And there are 2 words, phrases that are used in more recent literature. That's finance capitalism and rentier capitalism. And the reason we're looking around for how to label what's happening, as words are very important in focusing on the key dynamics. And what's happening today, as Radhika just pointed out in her lecture, is not what industrial capitalism looked like in the 19th century. And to the extent that Marx described the problems that we're having today, he thought that they were problems that capitalism was going to get rid of, not problems that it's currently causing. Well, the aim of industrialists, let's talk what it was supposed to be. The aim of industrial capitalists for the entire century of classical political economy, from the physiocrats to Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Thorstein Veblen, was to make profits by employing labor. And this led them to want to minimize the cost of labor. They recognized that well-paid, well-fed, and well-housed labor was more productive, but they still wanted to minimize its cost of living. And that required minimizing the cost that labor needed to pay out of the paychecks that they received from their employers. And the largest element of this paycheck was rent. Is rent today. It was food in the early 19th century. In both cases, this charge out of labor's basic wage was paid to the landlords. And the objective of industrial capitalism was radical, therefore. It was to free economies from the carryover of feudal characteristics. So it was really post-feudal capitalism is what they wanted. And they especially land rent paid to the landlords, but also monopolies that just increased the cost of living for labor and for other capitalists. Now, Radhika has pointed out that the tendency of capitalism itself is to concentrate production in the form of monopolies. But a capitalist monopoly is not the same thing as the rentier monopolies that were around in the 19th century and were simply predatory monopolies, not efficient monopolies, but just claims on the ability to levy monopoly rents on the prices that people had to pay. So industrial capitalism wanted to get rid of the landlord class, the monopolies that they paid mainly. The monopolies that capitalism wanted to get rid of were created, basically they were given away to financiers in exchange for loans to wage war. And the creditor said, well, we're going to give you the loan, but you have to give us a monopoly so we can just collect money in our sleep, just like the landlords do. So in addition to the monopolies, the industrial capitalists, as Radhika just described, wanted to end predatory banking that was geared towards making war loans to governments and petty loans and usury. And they wanted to, for the first time, to get banking integrated with the industrial sector by actually making loans for industry, not just for war and for overhead reasons. Well, these aims seem to be on the way to taking place in the late 19th century. And in a way, you'd think that we've gone beyond this. The West no longer has a hereditary landlord class. About half of American families are homeowners, falling rapidly. It's fallen by 10 percentage points just since the Obama wave of evictions and support of the banks in 2008 and 9, but as much as 80% of many European countries are homeowners. The problem is that in today's capitalism still has land rent. And that is a major cost of wage earners' budgets. About 40% of the wage earners' income in the United States has to go for paying rent. How can an industrial capitalist make money when wage earners have to pay these enormous rental charge? The difference is that although there's no landlord class, the land rent still exists and it's paid to the banks. Bankers today play the role that landlords did in the 19th century. Anybody can buy a home, but in order to buy a home, you have to take out a mortgage loan. And whether you're buying a home or commercial rental property, the buyer bids against other buyers, and the winner is the buyer who's willing to pay the most of the rental value. That is not the cost of the building, but just the cost of the rented location. The site value as interest to the banks. And so the banks now end up with all the land rent that the 19th century expected to be either the tax base or if not the tax base, then the government would own the land directly. And what we have, therefore, is not the kind of capitalism that Marx and his contemporaries described. What should we call it? Well, the term capitalism is too broad to just say for itself. So I think we have to say that, something more specific to say that there are different kinds of capitalism. And how do we distinguish what today really is a novel distortion of everything that industrial capitalism began to be? And the two major suggestions, as I said, are finance capitalism and rentier capitalism. Well, rentiers make money in their sleep without playing a productive role. The landlords, the old monopoly renters, and the banks do not play a role in the productive process. Marx called this the sphere of circulation, not the sphere of production. However, the producers have to somehow pay this sphere of circulation as an overhead on production. And calling it rentier capitalism emphasizes the fact that interest and financial fees are a form of economic rent. Banks have a privilege of simply creating credit on their keyboards. You go into a bank, the bank doesn't say, let me see how much money we have to lend you. They'll print in the loan, they'll create a deposit for you, and the buyer will sign an IOU, so the bank has an asset to balance the debt. And that privilege essentially enables the banks to collect interest instead of having banking either become part of the capitalist industrial process, as it was in Germany, as Radhika pointed out, or as it is supposed to be in socialist countries. So that's an argument for calling it rentier capitalism with a financial character. And in fact, it's an argument also for calling today's economies finance capitalist, because financial centers are the main political and ideological defenders of the other rentier sectors. Of all the rent-grabbing sectors, finance is their organizer. And its mode of ownership now goes beyond merely extracting income, but it actually aims at gaining fortunes in a way that the 19th century hardly envisioned. It's capital gains. The capital gains in the United States are as large as the gain in the entire GDP every year. And yet, if you only look at the flow of income in economy, income and expenses, you miss the big point that almost all of the great fortunes of the wealthiest 1%, 10% of the population have not been made by making profits. They have not been made by saving money by wage earners out of income. They've been made by banks inflating the prices of real estate and stocks and bonds on credit with debt leveraging. So in effect, the seeming success of creating fortunes has created a bifurcated economy where the fortunes are made by the 1% by getting the 99% into debt. So homeowners and buyers of industrial companies, named corporate raiders or private capital companies, borrow the money to buy a company, and then essentially use their income not to plow into new means of production, as Marx and everybody else in the 19th century expected capitalists to do. But 92% of corporate income in the United States is paid for stock buybacks or to pay out as dividends. Well, already by the time that World War I developed, there was a big argument, even in England, that I've described in my books, Killing the Host. The English feared that the Germans are going to win the war because instead of their companies being told by their banks, well, pay out dividends, buy your own stocks, the banks encouraged the German companies to reinvest their profits in new means of production and expansion, whereas the English banks just were hit and run. They'd make a loan, they'd wanted a quick payback, and as Radhika pointed out, finance lives in the short run, not the long run. Industrial capitalism was supposed to have a long-term strategy, and corporate investment was supposed to be long-term as a way of building markets. That hasn't occurred. Finance capitalism is short-term because finance lives in the short run, and it's basically predatory. Hit one customer, go on to the next. So to show how the laws of motion in this rentier finance capitalism have evolved, I think I'm going to take three different dynamics that I'll describe: the geopolitical dynamic, the domestic dynamic, and the historical dynamic. I'll first of all talk about how economic surpluses are extracted in the domestic economy. And the best way is to look at this is who gets the economic surplus, rent, profits, and the overall surplus, and what form does it take? Now we get back to feudalism, just as an example. In the 13th century, the immediate recipients were the warlord kings and the who were acting as legal vassals of Rome. Rome would essentially, the papacy wanted to conquer countries who wouldn't allow it to dominate their economies. This was the imperial papacy of the Crusades in the 12th and the 13th century. So to get an army, the papacy said went to the Norman warlords and said, they went to Robert Guiscard and said, if you conquer southern Italy and Spain, we'll announce that you're the king and you're ruling by divine right, and we'll have all the churches support you. And then a few years later, they went to William the Conqueror, another Norman warlord, and said, if you conquer England, we'll immediately applaud you as the conquerors. Now, as Radhika said, the purpose of conquering a land was to get the rent. And even after the warlords conquered England, southern Italy, Spain, and other countries, the largest landowners in every European country were the church. And the kings got the rent. And what did they do? The banks, the Vatican said, well, we need to go to war against Germany, against the Islamic countries, countries who won't let us dominate them and take all of their rents and send them to Rome. So you have to, first of all, tax the rent of your land by levying taxes. But their taxes aren't enough to pay for the war. So you have to borrow from the banks that we've set up. The problem in the 11th century by Western Christianity was that it hated early Christianity. It said, we've got to get rid of everything, of all of the anti-usury laws in Christianity, and finance is going to be what we're going to have to create in order to finance the wars, so that we can use all the rents of the land to essentially to conquer countries that won't accept our leadership. You may see where I'm going with this, for the parallel with the United States. But the Roman papacy had essentially opposed usury and sponsored bankers to lend the money. Industrial capitalism is very different. What made them different from the pre-existing economy was that they made money by labor, not by having labor create land rent and crops, but by being employed to produce industrial goods. So for the first time, you had a shift from an economy based on rent and usury to an economy that was based on actual profits being reinvested into new capitalist production. So Marx still placed rent in the context of money turned into commodities to make more money. But today, most finances are made simply, money makes more money by financial engineering based on credit creation and debt leveraging. So money creates debt creation, which is used to raise the prices of real estate, stocks, and bonds, and independently of the industrial process. Well, this has been called Neo-Feudalism because it revives the dynamics of a financialized rentier income from which the 19th century economy sought to free itself. So that aim, as I mentioned, was what classical economics was all about. And they really thought that the logic was so clear that economies, certainly the industrial capitalists, would work in their own self-interest to free economies from economic rent and from the predatory banking, mainly for unproductive purposes, not for production. But what happened already in the late 19th century, the rentier interests fought back, and they were led by the financial sector. And that resilience of economic parasitism and the rentier overhead is what characterizes today's finance capitalism. Well, now we get into another way of looking at what's happened is the geopolitical setting. Who gets the economic surplus? And capitalism and feudalism both sought expansion. Every exploitative system seeks expansion, and that ever-present drive makes the most powerful economies imperialistic. And imperialism traditionally has been rent-seeking. Simply asset stripping, translating rents and profits, if there's foreign industry, into monetary form is tribute. And it's also a drive for unipolar control. One indicator of the dynamics of rentier finance capitalism and the form that its exploitation takes is to look at what countries receive most of the international economic surplus. Well, in the 13th century, as I said, Western Europe's imperial papacy saw Rome receive tribute not only from its churches in every kingdom, but also from the vassal kings that were told, raise taxes, send it to Rome. We need it to fight, to hire mercenaries to fight wars, and for you to get all of your knights and nobles and to fight wars too. And essentially, that's what flowered into the Crusades, into a full-blown fight against other Christian countries. Am I running over? Okay. Okay. Well, and war funding essentially transformed the economy by creating financial interests that finally ended up saying, well, we've already got pushed all of the kings of Europe into debt by the 16th century. And by the early 17th century, the problem was that kings would keep going broke, and all that the creditors could get when the debts went bad was the collateral of kings, or all the money that they could tax. And they wanted all the money the economy had. So the creditors, for the first time, turned against the Christian concept of divine rule, and they said, we want parliamentary democracy, because parliamentary democracy Holland and other Protestant countries can pledge the entire income of the country to pay debt. So the key to the political evolution that shaped the social evolution that led to industrial capitalism was essentially finance. Transforming all of this and modernizing the economy's ability to create a surplus because they knew that the surplus would be paid to the financial sector. Well, by the 19th century, as Radhika pointed out, the leading global economic power was Britain, and it used its industrial profits and military colonialism and trade financing to gain control of foreign raw materials in exchange for its products and to gain control ownership of foreign land, foreign property, and essentially foreign governments, ostensibly as the workshop of the world. But you could also call it, even at that time, the rentier of the world. Labor was replacing land as the exploited factor of production under capitalism. But the 20th century saw the United States replace Britain's role. And at first, this was by a combination of industrial power, and then after World War I, as the leading creditor to Britain and other countries, America greatly expanded its rentier mode of production after 1945 by establishing the dollar as a major currency held in foreign central bank reserves, seemingly is as good as gold. Military spending in Southeast Asia forced the dollar off gold in 1971, but it convinced other countries not to replace gold, not to hold gold themselves, but to buy treasury IOUs, treasury bonds, in which to hold their international savings. And so they lent essentially the more balance of payment surpluses Germany and Europe and Asia would get, Japan, they relent it to the United States government that's financed its domestic deficit to and the balance of payments costs of its military spending, which were the entire cost of the balance of payments deficit up through the 1960s and 70s, the Vietnam War, on military spending, and it's essentially got a free ride. This is a financial rentier economy in an unprecedented form, although I'm sure England did something like that, akin to that in India. Well, this is not how Marx and other 19th century economists expected capitalism to evolve. And by the time the Reagan administration in the 1980s, 5 minutes?
Could you wrap up in
2 minutes?
Yes, please.
Wait, I have to turn it louder to hear you.
Yes, please. Could you wrap up in 2? I'm sorry, but
Wait 1 second. I have to get the. No, can you repeat?
would you try to wrap up in 2 if you can?
Yes. Okay. It's a unipolar financial economy, and that tendency towards unipolarism, this attempt to dominate other economies, is one of the neo-feudal characteristics. It's the same dynamic internationally that the Catholic Church had and that England had. And what has happened is that you've had under this system a revival of all of the forms of economic rent that were created in feudalism. The kings tried to use enough taxes in medieval times to pay the debts, but that wasn't enough. So the financiers came in and said, let us help you create monopolies, trade monopolies, and that will create money, and you can pay us out of the monopoly gains. Well, this is pretty much what the United States is doing in the global South countries and other countries, trying to create political and economic control systems in order to gain their economic surpluses. That's basically it. I could go down, you yourself can probably fill out the blanks to see all of the parallels between what's happening in today's financial capitalism, which is the mother of monopolies, more or less, and the historical characteristics of pre-capitalist economy that industrial capitalism was supposed to get rid of and failed. So you could look at today's rentier financial economy as the failure of industrial capitalism to succeed in the way that Marx and other 19th century economists expected.